Hello. Hello. Everybody in the club. Okay, so we're gonna get started now. Thanks everybody for coming to the third Design Systems Coalition NYC meetup. Woo! How many folks came to the last one? How many? Yeah? Okay, cool. It's nice to see you all again. Thank you very much for coming again. Thank you very much to Justworks for hosting this. This is a great space. Thank you very much for also recording this. That's awesome. We can make the video available to you all later, so you can relive the memories, and then those folks that couldn't make it can also watch it. So thank you very much, Justworks, and thank you very much also for the food and the drink. You can round of applause that one as well. I also want to say thanks to everybody that helped put this event on. Thank you very much to the speakers for volunteering their time to write their talks and be here tonight. And to Jackson, who's been on the door tonight, and Tom, and Henry, who's taking photos. So we all just do this because we love design systems. And also just wanted to give another shout out. We do have a website now, and so you can go there to see photos and videos from and slide decks from previous events. So that'll be all up there. Quick reminder about the format. So we have 3 times 10-minute lightning talks. We keep them short, and they're focused on one topic. And tonight, that is documenting design systems. And that is so that you can be inspired, think of questions, and then we have a Q&A session afterwards, so that you have a lot of opportunity to ask questions. And then there'll be some more time for socializing afterwards. So, first up, we have Tom Takigayama. I practiced saying your surname. I know Tom from when we both worked at Etsy back in the day. And he's also a product design lead here at Justworks. And he spends time nurturing Milo, which is, I believe, your dog, right? Yeah. There's lots of cute photos on Instagram. And so Tom tonight is going to talk a bit about like how they started with their design system, their first design system. So over to you. Welcome, Tom.
So this is my first public speaking talk, so please be gentle. Yeah. 4 mistakes. I'm going to walk you through 4 mistakes that I made while working on the Justworks design system. My name is Tom. I am the product design lead at Justworks, and this is my presentation. But first, what is Justworks? We are the hosting company. You all know that from the meetup page. But what Justworks actually does is we're an all-in-one solution offering benefits, HR, support, compliance, and payroll to small and medium-sized companies. And what that essentially means is that if you're a startup or a small business looking to start your small business, then we're here to help you to take care of all the things that HR and company-related things that people don't really want to do, so that you can focus on your ideas and your customers. So that's Justworks, and we're also hiring. There's a product designer role out there and engineering roles out there. There's just one vital piece of information that you need to keep in mind, and that's when you go to this website and you start applying, put my name down as the referral so that I get the referral credits. It's a key point. But back to my talk. So full disclosure, just like this talk, this design system that we started at Justworks was my very first design system, actually working on it. I made a lot of mistakes, but I learned from them, And hopefully people in the same situation will learn from the mistakes that I've made. So as Diana mentioned, I worked at Etsy before. It was an amazing place, especially because there were so many great designers, many of who are in this audience. And the design system that they had, I wasn't working on it. I just got to use it. I was on the payments team, and the designers would the other designers would be working hard on this design system, and I would kind of ignore them and just do my own thing. Once I left Etsy, I realized that, and I came to Justworks, and then we started growing the design team. We started going from two to 3 to 4 designers. We realized that we also needed a design system. And that's when I realized that I took the other designers for granted. Like, they did all this work that I was ignoring, and I was basically eating my own words for it. So starting the design system at Justworks, I did what any designer, noob designer would do, and that's to go to like the public design systems that were available. I looked at Salesforce's Lightning, Atlassian's design system, which didn't look like this before, but looks like this now. And Solid's BuzzFeed's design system, even like GitHub's design system, and all the other ones that were out there. And what I realized is that that was my first mistake that I made. I focused too much on what other people were doing, and then the mistake I made was thinking that someone else's solutions were the answers to my problem, and the situations are always different for every single company, and I realized that these other companies that have more established and more mature design systems, they had resources for people to work on them. They had all these systems that they thought about for a long time. And I was actually curious to see how many people work on the design system for the company here. And then of those people, how many of you work on the design system plus other product features? Oh, so you all know my pain. And so out of all of you, if I think eventually we would want to move to have a dedicated Justworks design system team. So if any of you have stories that are good to help promote that, maybe you could talk to my manager and try to get him to approve it. His name is Adam. He looks like this. So then, managing multiple product features and working on that, in addition to the design system, it really wasn't scalable. It just I kept on trying to mimic all these design systems I was seeing and being like, these are so great. I want us to be exactly like this. And what I realized is that I was thinking that I could run a marathon, but I didn't have the time to train for it. So I realized that I just didn't it wasn't gonna work. I'm gonna skip that slide. But also, while looking at all these other design systems, I realized it was also my second mistake. And my second mistake was focusing on the delivery of the focusing on the delivery of the design system and not the actual content of it. I think a lot of times, I started off the design system beta in a Google Docs, and I was going down a good path because I was like, okay, I just need to get this out. I need to collect all the information and have it in one single place. But then I fell off the track and I went down a different path and was like, okay, now I'm done with the Google Doc. I can go and create this amazing design system that's all custom. The documentation is going to be fit us perfectly for our needs. We're going to custom build this thing. And we even went as far as actually starting to build this. But then what we realized is that the more and more we spent time working on this, we were working on the delivery system and less on the actual content of it. And we ended up like, we would debate the order of the order of the navigation. We would debate like how to push things into it. And this was part of the actual Justworks code base and the app. So every time they wanted to make an update, the engineers had to like submit a pull request and go through that whole process just to update like a design system. And it really wasn't working, and it was hindering our like progress. But it was the holy grail because everything, you know, everything was in there. It was all interactive, so it was very. It's something that we wanted to do, but we realized that we just couldn't do it at the time. And we were a very small team. We were still like working on it. Everyone here, it was like a side project that they were working on. And then what we realized is that we really just needed to like divide and conquer this, because we don't have the resources to dedicate all this time for it. Eventually it didn't work out, but anyway. So we pivoted, and what we did was we actually separated the documentation, and I think it was actually Jeremy, my partner in the design system, who's sitting back there. His idea was to actually, you know, what if we just split the documentation and the design system part of it so that we're more efficient? And he handled the technical side of it, and I handled the visual and the design and the pattern side of it. I chose Confluence, which most people hate. I also don't necessarily enjoy it, but it had a few things that were great. You know, it was only people in the company can access it. It was automatic. That was baked in. They have all these different features that you can add on to it pretty easily. So that was nice. Of course, the actual design of it drives me crazy. You know, if you're ever in Confluence and you look at an H2 and wonder why there's more padding on that specific H2 and not H1 and H3, it just drives me crazy. Anyway, so we just put everything into Confluence, and it was super easy to update. There was no pull requests. We could update it on the fly, and we went down that route. And then from the technical perspective, Jeremy set up a system where he included a general README in the components folder to explain how the React components worked. And then in the individual components, he also included READMEs that said exactly how those components worked, in addition to having access to the .jsx file, which had all the prop types, and that way the engineers knew exactly what kind of like variations this component has. And that really worked well, because all the engineers, this lived where the engineers were already living. So that was a really good part. So we got the best of both worlds. Of course, the system is not perfect. You know, like referencing both back and forth is kind of a little bit janky, and you know, like I said, Confluence isn't the greatest thing in the world, but it works for the situation that we're in, and that's like, we just don't have time to like dedicate to make this amazing design system documentation website. Eventually, we'll get there. I think Jeremy's actually working or playing around with React Storybook, so you can bother him about it for anyone who's more technically inclined than I am. So, mistake number 3, not documenting the principles. And I actually remember a conversation with Diana when I was starting the Justworks design system, and she told me about things that she learned, and she mentioned how documentation or principles were super important. And of course, I didn't follow that advice. And I did focus on like why do we needed a design system, and that was more to like sell it to, you know, the team and the engineers and the designers. But I realized that it was missing like how we're actually going to implement the design system, and this led to a lot of like ambiguous talks about how we're going to actually make a component and what does it actually mean, and then depending on the project, like certain things would come up, and we wouldn't actually we would not have a like consistent guideline of how to implement these or design these components, and a lot of times they would just end up being like kind of fluid, like, oh, it works in this case, right? And then a few months later, it's like, oh, well, we forgot about, this team or this case. So today, that's, we're focusing on actually going back and taking a break and focusing on the principles first, because we realize that that's super important to have any sort of conversation going forward. And that's where we're today. And so hopefully, in the future, I will go from having no idea what I'm doing to having some idea what I'm doing. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. That was awesome. And I love hearing how people didn't listen to me and then realized I was right. It's awesome. So next up, we have Adekunle Oduye, who works at NASDAQ. And we had a really great chat. I spend some time talking to all the speakers before we do these. And that's actually one of the most fun parts of me, because we just get to talk about design systems and what their experience and lessons have been. And he's going to talk about how he kind of, I guess, learned to maybe like documentation. Who likes documentation? Who likes writing? Oh my God, we have got maybe a particularly niche audience here. All the crazies here. So without further ado, over to Adekunle and your experience.
Yeah, thank you. So this is my talk, The Evolution of Documentation at NASDAQ. And basically, before I talk about anything about within my talk, I always like to go over my name. I know it's difficult, but that's how you say it. So just in case you want to talk to me later on. No, you did good. You did good. So like Diana said, I'm a product designer at NASDAQ. I build web-based products for investor relationship officers, which sounds very crazy, but it's pretty interesting. Other than that, I'm a co-organizer for Gotham SaaSconf. So if you're interested in any tech talks or whatever like that, look for us at Meetup. So what I'm gonna kind of go over is two main things. First thing, how to write useful documentation. Like I said, when I was starting out, I didn't write documentation well, and I didn't really like it, but I kind of learned the process and kind of how to write it and have a good outline and whatnot. Second, I want to kind of talk about how writing good documentation can also increase usage of a design system. This is definitely important for people that work in the corporate world. I work at NASDAQ, so we have many different design teams and development teams, so we kind of have to where we write good documentation to increase the usage. So before I talk about where we at right now, I'm going to talk about where we started. So when we started out, we had basically a simple pattern library. And it kind of got stuff done because it was only for the GCS product design team, so that's the department I work for. And basically the main purpose was kind of created for us to kind of build stuff, but also build stuff with the front-end code. So a lot of it was just kind of creating prototypes, so a lot of it wasn't semantic, or it wasn't even thinking about accessibility and stuff like that. So we kind of where we were just building stuff out and kind of making our designs more interactable and making it where it was easy to kind of distribute to different teams. And if you want to have check-ins or whatever like that, we just literally send them a prototype. So this is kind of example of how it worked. It was within one team. So usually if someone had a question about a specific pattern or whatever like that, you just drop a line in Slack and kind of figure out talk about it. So this is the first version of it. So we kind of used the framework Pattern Lab because we couldn't actually build our own. And then this is kind of how we had our buttons. So we really had no documentation at all. So literally it was buttons, we got the HTML, and then we had notes, which no one ever filled out, but. This is the same thing with the alerts. I'm gonna use buttons and alerts because it's very simple examples. So it's kind of the same thing where we have basically the pattern, the markup and then like notes, which again no one ever uses. But there was a couple of problems we ran into when we were kind of like sharing this out to different teams. One of them was basically people were misusing the patterns. So even simple, like for a button, like we have 6 variations, and basically what happened was like people used a button when they should be using a link, and they'll use like the green button instead of the red button. So it got kind of messy at first. And then the implementation wasn't very good. We were using Bootstrap back in the day, and I have a whole argument about using Bootstrap, but just a good understanding was like our how to get our styles and interactions within our within people's projects and products. It was kind of difficult, so less people were actually using it. And like I was saying before, we had kind of too many variations. I could say for specific, like for like tables, we had basically like 7 iterations, like 7 versions of how to style a table, which didn't really make sense, but we just kept on adding to the pattern. So kind of how we ended up kind of rebranding. It was kind of like a UI guidelines, and basically what we did was kind of had to figure out like how we want to make it where it's better for not for us, but also people that are going to be using our patterns, and how can we help them with that. So we kind of had to break it down to 3 specific teams. And this is kind of what we kind of envisioned, where we wanted our UI guidelines to be able to be shared between many different products. So this is kind of how like the team was broken down. Basically, we had a person, like a group of people that work on the framework. So this is kind of like building the components, make sure it's kind of scalable, make sure it actually works. And then we had a creative team that actually kind of were establishing how like a button should look, how like what's the padding, all this other stuff. And then you had this other team with crazy people that are like working on documentation. And the thing was, like, I wasn't part of the framework team or the creative team, so obviously I was working on the documentation, and I was like, who wants to work on documentation? Which is interesting. And what kind of happened was, like, when I was working on it, I was like, oh, it's not that bad. And I'm a team player, so I was like, I'm willing to do whatever. But basically, we had kind of like a simple process for creating documentation. So we used Trello to kind of like have basically list all our patterns. And basically kind of like what we had was like most of the people that are working on documentation, they couldn't dedicate so much time on it. So basically what we did is like we had these labels dedicated as like if it's easy or if it's going to be hard. So depending on how much time you have between projects, you can actually kind of figure out which pattern to pick up. And this is kind of like an example of like how I was kind of writing it. If some of you can't read it, but basically what I had was like the usage, visual details, and then kind of like the technical, like kind of saying which kind of elements you're gonna use or whatnot. So this is kind of like the typical outline like we kind of figured out like down the line. So basically we have kind of like an overview, so like what it is basically, so if it's a button, like this is a button, blah, blah, blah. And then we had the implementation. So we had just the, just like any code, so if it's like, HTML, CSS, or JavaScript, we just kind of include that just to make it easier for them. The big thing that was actually good and tested well was like, we actually included usage, because this actually brings context of like when to use specific things, especially when you have variations. It's definitely helpful for people to know which one to use. And then we had visual details. I put an asterisk because like in most cases, you don't really need to have this, especially if you're working with something very simple. And then do's and don'ts. I think this is definitely important if you're working with something that's very complex, but if it's not, then you don't really necessarily need it. So this is kind of like what we had right now, where this is kind of like where we kind of showing what the button is, kind of like the markup language, and kind of like the actual options. And then this is kind of, I think, the best use of where you have usage. So this is kind of telling people like when to use one button or other. So we have a default, we have a primary, and all this other stuff. And usually what people do, they come here as like, I know I need a button. They could come here and kind of read and see like, all right, I know I don't need a default, but I probably need a primary. So this is kind of how like it was kind of laid out. Basically we have, and I think with buttons, it was like one of the longest documentations because we had so many different sizes and variations. So we had like kind of what you've seen before, options, usage, and then we had sizes, and we also had another thing where we had spacing. This was actually a huge thing because people didn't know like how, like if they're using a group of buttons, like the distance between each of them. So we kind of had to illustrate that too. And then this is kind of the same thing with the alerts, where we kind of have the same thing where we have the alert, the overview, and then we have the kind of like the actual HTML. And then with this, it includes some JavaScript because it's actually gonna like some interactivity. And then we have the same thing with the usage. So we kind of have this pattern going on within all our patterns. And this was actually good because then we actually started creating a data visualization library. And this, like the background about this is that we didn't have like kind of like a consistent way of actually showing data visualization. So we kind of figured out that it would be a good idea to kind of create a visualization library and use kind of like the framework we use for the UI guidelines to kind of create that. Oops, sorry. So a lot of it was like document like driven, because especially with data viz, like most people don't know the process, and the process is very kind of, it's like for me, I worked in NASDAQ for a while and I still didn't know the process, but it's kind of like understanding the data first and kind of seeing what kind of data story you want to kind of tell. So this is kind of how we kind of collaborated with, we used Dossier, but basically what we did is like we kind of like create like an overview data story and have people kind of commenting like if stuff makes sense or whatnot. And basically this is kind of how we have it right now. We kind of have where this is like the landing page of it. And the thing with what we did for this is that we only started with 4 charts because there's like probably like 11 or 12 charts we could use, but we kind of use it where this is kind of testing out if the documentation makes sense, since this is very document heavy. So, and then this is kind of like what we call like a profile. So each chart has its own profile basically. And what we kind of have is like we have an overview, and underneath that we kind of have the data story. So it's like a lot of content. And the thing about this is like we're always trying to test if this makes sense, because a lot of the times, especially if you're working with anyone that's not a designer developer, you kind of have to understand if they're going to use something, they kind of have to kind of make sure it makes sense to them, and they be able to empower them to actually build stuff, basically. And then we also include use cases, and then we also included do's and don'ts. This is still in beta, so what we're kind of trying to do in the future is kind of have visuals to kind of illustrate do's and don'ts, because that's probably the best way to kind of like have people learn about it. So I actually was kind of thinking about like how to kind of compare it, and I always compare it to like, you know, actual product and instructions. I was like, for me, when I buy something new, I never read instructions until something goes wrong. So it's kind of the same thing with the design system, where most likely people are not going to read it at first, but if they have questions or whatever like that, they're usually going to go back and like how do I do this or that? And it's also an educational tool, I think, especially if you work for like a bigger company. I think in most cases, like we talk about UI, but you can make a library system for charts, or even just by like writing. So if you think about it, it's going to be an educational tool, especially if a lot of people don't know necessarily how to do specific stuff. So I know that was a lot. So in summary, I hope you kind of get to understand like how to write good docs. And I think the basis is just trying to figure out like how to implement something, and also to talk about the usage. Another thing is like always ask for help within the company. I think when we were kind of creating the data visualization library, we actually had a content strategist that actually is helping us out with the actual content. So most of you might not have a content strategist, but just get anyone that's like willing to help or it's good at writing to actually help you out. And also test out your documentation. Gotta make sense, like if you have a design system, it's the actual product. So if you wanna get people to use them even more, you wanna kinda test it out if it makes sense. And especially if the documentation is like really huge and long and very complex, you kinda wanna test it out and ask people if it makes sense. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Thank you.
Awesome, thank you. Thank you so much. That was great. I really like the idea of documentation driven. That's awesome. I'm gonna steal that and use it. I'll quote you. So next up, really excited. Our final speaker tonight is Amélie Lamont. She's a product designer and design nerd at the New York Times, and also one of my favorite people to follow on Twitter. Very interesting discussions. I learn a lot. And yeah, she's going to talk. She specializes in using cultural studies and design anthropology to inform her design process. And tonight she's going to talk about language and design systems. So welcome, Amélie.
Okay, so as Diana mentioned, we're going to be talking about language and design systems. I'm a little weird. I'm just going to put that out front now. Oh, shut up. Man, don't be telling people. Shoot. Okay, so the broader implications of language in design systems. So I think before we can really dive into this conversation, the first thing that we need to do is talk about what is the purpose of language, right? Like, why do we even use it? What is this stuff that's coming out of my mouth and entering your ears and your brains and being processed? And I think the best way to think about language is it's a way for humans to communicate with one another. It's a way for us to have a common understanding. It's a way for us to level set and to make sure that the information that I share with you is understood and the information that you're sharing with me is understood. When we think about design systems, I think it's important for us to zoom out and to start thinking about wants versus needs in terms of language, as well as goals, expectations, and metrics. So what are all of those things? Okay, so wants versus needs. When I say that, I'm thinking about in terms of what your wants are, what your team's needs are, and vice versa. What is it that you want to be put into the design system? And what is it that your team is going to be getting out of the design system? Same thing for goals. Like, why are you building this design system? Does your team know why you're building this design system? And then in terms of expectations, what do you want to get out of this design system? Like, why does it even exist? Are you building it because you went to BuzzFeed's site and you're like, oh, solid, yeah, I'm gonna build one too. That's not don't do that shit. Metrics, that's really important too, because depending on what team you are on and the size of the company that you're on is, or the size of the company that you're working at is, metrics are really important. It's a way to measure the success of the design system. So are you thinking about that, and is that embedded in the language, the shared language that you're using across the company? So when we think about design systems, and specifically, I have a lot of contention with the word design for design systems, right? Because there are a lot of people who hear that word. It's very new in terms of this industry. Like, what is a design system? Like, what does that mean? And as time goes on, we'll figure out a way to define it, but I think it's really important to hone in on the language because there are a lot of people who are very confused about what design is, right? Like, just make this look pretty, okay? Like, just do that shit. Make it pop. It's fledgling and new. But I think it's important for us to take a step back, right? What is design? So I went on a Google search and I was like, I'm about to find out what design is. I'm gonna get to the bottom of this shit. Okay, ready? Design is about progress. Okay. A good designer should be a good artist. No. Okay. Design is a method of problem solving. Okay. Believe it or not, design is not just about the fonts, colors, images, or a layout a designer chooses. Okay, that's excessive. Design is what links creativity and innovation. Okay, so do you see what I'm saying? Like, there are so many ways to define what design is. So if we, and these are all definitions that came from designers, right? So if 5 designers can't even figure out what design is, how is the industry going to figure out what design is? And how the hell are you going to explain to your team what a design system is? Everyone has a different concept of what design is, right? that shared language is really important, but you don't have a shared language if we're just tossing around the words design system. This is also one of my favorites. I just like Googled what is design, and it was like, images, icons, things. That's not helpful to people who aren't designers. Okay. So I think we often get caught up in a lot of jargon, and jargon in itself is obscure and often pretentious language marked by circumlocutions and long words. Even this whole thing, circumlocutions, that's jargon. Why is that even in the definition? That don't even make no sense. Okay, so basically what I'm saying is that jargon, when we're thinking about design systems, it's a barrier to getting people on board to understanding why you're creating this design system. And it leads to suffering. People are in pain. See that woman's face? She's suffering. So then we go back and we start thinking about why do we create design systems? We create design systems because, yes, again, we are suffering. I say that because oftentimes than not, with design systems, there's a problem of some sort, right? We realize that we're doing the same thing over and over and over and over again. And we're like, why do we keep creating the same button? Didn't you create a button for that login page like 3 weeks ago? Yeah, I did, but I mean, the one that you made just, I don't like it. Doesn't make any sense. That means that there's no shared language. There's no understanding about why you're doing the work that you're doing. And I think ultimately what it leads to is a wasteful reproduction of seemingly important, but ultimately insignificant and unsustainably made design artifacts, buttons included. So I brought up this example from the New York Times because you hear the New York Times and you're like, oh, New York Times, paper of record, they have such good design. And I just wanted to show you what our navigations throughout the site look like. So this is the navigation that you see at the top when you first get to the page. This is one of the navigations in our pay flow. This is a navigation that you see when you're reading an article. This is just another navigation that like shrinks when you get to, when this, basically, when you're scrolling down the page, this turns into this. And this is a navigation from the cooking site. Then you have even more navigations. You have the New York Times store, the New York Times wine club, the school of the New York Times, the New York Times real estate, New York Times journeys, New York Times subscriber login. These are all different. And I bring this up to say, the New York Times is very large, and there are quite a few designers there. I think there are probably about 50 some odd designers. And when we think about design and design systems, oftentimes than not, there's a lot of confusion. They're like, why do we need a design system? This is why we need a design system. The New York Times can get away with this because the company is so large and it's so old and it's so well known. So people think of it and they just have this idea about the Times as being very prestigious for design. But when you actually dive in, you start realizing that there's no continuity, and it leads to confusion and it causes problems. So obviously this is inefficient. And I think if we start to zoom in a little bit, we start realizing that as designers and developers, when we think about design systems, we come to this solution because we just want to build something. We don't want to think about having to recreate the same buttons over and over again. We didn't come to work to repeat the same thing that someone else did or to do things that are insignificant. We just want to build things, build great things, right? That's where systems thinking comes into play. So systems thinking is problem solving that attempts to balance holistic thinking and reductionistic thinking. So holistic thinking is the entire view, right? And reductionistic thinking would be like componentized thinking. So what you normally think of when you think of a design system, so pattern libraries, the different components, the pieces that make together the entire whole. And this is where the common language comes into play, because it helps us to focus on collaboration. No one really cares about the name of your design system. I'm gonna be real, like, clarity, solid, what's another one? Lightning. No one cares. Marketing doesn't care about the name of your design system, I promise you. What marketing wants is something that helps them to get their stuff done, So that focuses on their goals, their metrics, their wants, their needs, etc. So the way we do this when we're thinking about a common language, and the reason why this common language is so important when it comes to design systems is that, first and foremost, it helps us to implement constraints. This is not a great example, but the best example I could find. So constraints from Apple, from their design system for people who are global training providers, do this, but not this. These constraints are really important because I know a lot of designers and even developers are like, constraints, I don't want it, like it'll like, like screw my creativity. No. Like, if you're a designer who can work within constraints or an engineer who can work within constraints, I would say that makes you a better designer or engineer because it means that you understand boundaries and it stretches you to work even harder and smarter. It also removes cognitive overload because you're not thinking as much. You're not thinking about the small things that everyone else was thinking about before the design system existed, right? For example, this is IBM's Carbon design system. And this is obviously their documentation page, but it's amazing. If I'm a designer, I just go to the designer section or the developer section, and I can read step by step every little thing that I have to do. There's no thinking about it. It just tells me what I need to do in order to get this system done to build the products that I need to build. Then also, my favorite thing about design systems when we're thinking about that shared common language is that it starts moving you towards solving bigger problems. I love this example from when Airbnb launched their new design. I know everyone said that looked like a butt. I don't think it looks like a butt. But what's nice about this is they were able, with their design system in existence, they were able to focus not on the design system itself or processes because that was already figured out. They were like, okay, let's zoom out and actually think about how the design and the work that we're creating affects the people in the community of Airbnb as a whole. What's nice about a design system is that because you're not focusing on buttons and you're not focusing on typography or colors, etc., you're now freed up as a designer to expand your mind and start focusing on bigger problems that a company normally would not be able to think about if they didn't have a design system that had a shared language in place. So again, just want you to keep in mind wants versus needs. What is it that you want out of the design system? What is it that you need out of the design system? But then also, what do your partners, marketing, engineering, the CEO, et cetera, what are their wants and needs? And how do you bake that into the design system? What are the goals? Why are you building the design system? But not just you, why is the company building this design system? Why do you even want this? What do you expect the design system to do? And what do people in the company expect the design system to do? And finally, what are the metrics? So once you build this design system, how are you going to measure how successful it is? You did a lot of work creating that shared language and that common understanding amongst everyone. Now you have to prove that this works and that there's value in this system. How will you do it? And that's it.
Thank you so much. That was awesome. So now we are going to smoothly bring some stools on stage, and we're going to have a Q&A session. So think about questions that you would like to ask our speakers tonight. Do we have... Oh, we're cool. Is this the roaming mic? And that's the... Okay. So... Oh, there's a question already. I'll run around here. Yeah, question.
Hey. I work with some of the people on the Carbon design system, so thanks for the shout out. I told them, and I'm sure they'll be excited. I'm considering making like a web style guide design system thing from Confluence. I'm considering the tools, but does that allow non-technical people to contribute to the system? And if so, what gates have you set up, if you can say that, to make sure that content is still, like, has some sort of a process or some sort of an easy way to roll back? That's kind of a constraint where I'm worried about in any sort of CMS that's easy enough for my brand strategist to commit to. How can I make sure that, like, commits are good?
I guess I'll give tutorial about Confluence, which I hate. I think the great thing about Confluence, sorry, the two questions were how do you gate it, and then how are people contributing to it, right? Or how easy it is.
Yeah, basically, like, is ease of contribution at odds with quality of content at all?
Right.
Or how do you balance that?
Yeah. So Confluence is one of the main reasons why we went with it is because it's super easy for non-technical people to contribute to it. And it has all these like macros, these basically widgets that you can apply and utilize. So it's really easy for anyone to contribute, even like non-technical designers. Of course, the issue is like how to make it tie in with the actual technical side of it. In regards to the gated part of it, there are like permissions that you could set for Confluence. We don't because I think we're still a relatively small company, and also if someone changes something, then you could just revert easily back to it. So all those things are kind of baked in to it, and that's one of the reasons why we went with it for now.
Does anyone want to add to that? Are you all good? Cool.
Don't touch
Oh.
Confluence.
Hi. So we work for a company that has many clients, and each of them has their own brand, has their own styles and systems in place. But we're looking at building a design system that will help us get started on the work a lot better. Do you guys have any advice on how to approach that? Because a lot of the design systems that we've researched have been for one brand or one company. So you can make typography choices, you can make color choices that way.
I don't have advice, but the previous design system meetup had the 2U presenter, which was really good, and on the website.
Yeah, I would check that one out. But I think these folks might. Do you have any experience with multiple brands?
I was going to say the same thing. You should check out 2U because I'm pretty sure their design system is public, and it's literally for that use case. So 2U is an education company, and what they do is they build out portals for different schools, and I think currently they have about 12 different schools, and each school has a different brand, and the design system is overarching, but each child of the design system focuses on the brand for that particular school. It's quite amazing, so I think it would be worth it to look into that.
Yeah, and both the other speakers from Etsy and GitHub talked about like how they have to distribute like the core parts of their system and adapt it to different like brand use cases. So yeah, check it out. Advertising in this meetup at the meetup. Cool. Any other questions? Okay, sweet. You and then you.
Hi, I have one for you because you were talking about first you had your system in a way that could be pulled and committed to, and then you moved it into Confluence. Did you have any problems doing that with maintaining consistency? Was there any other reasons for doing that change?
What do you mean by like maintaining consistency from the documentation standpoint or the actual design system standpoint?
The actual design systems.
Well, when we moved it over to Confluence, it was, again, we're still relatively small, so it's like the designers just access that. And I guess one thing that I didn't cover is that in addition to Confluence, we're always updating the sketch template that we're all using. So that allowed for the consistency from the design standpoint. And when that failed, because sometimes we'd be too busy to update the documentation, the engineering documentation is like the main thing that's it's the production code, so that's always consistent, no matter what. So as long as that is like set correctly, then that was like a good catch for like to make sure that nothing inconsistent made it actually into production. There are many times that the engineers come back and they're like, well, this isn't really right, and you're like, and then you just kind of sulk, but
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hey, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I had a question about I assume, when building a design system, it's not just about sketch, it's also about building rapport. How do you get buy-in from stakeholders? And then how do you get buy-in from the team? And who do you select for your team?
Yeah, so when we were building it out for at NASDAQ, we kind of had to get buy-in because they didn't really improve of like actual people working, spending time to actually build it out. So we kind of had to put it in a way where if we build something out, then it kind of is going to make it efficient for everyone else. And then you just kind of put some dollar sign on it. So it was like, you're going to save like $20 million if you kind of build yeah. So, and once they see that, they see the numbers, like, oh, wow, like, oh, I'm going to save that. So usually that's kind of how you have to brand it, especially I know for like a lot of corporate and like big, like, you can't really spend that much time, but you have to put it away where it's going to make the process so much better. And even when you have something where it's not only for your team, but it's also for like for all the engineering teams and product teams, they're gonna kind of see that it's gonna make it efficient and kind of like so where people don't have to spend like 20 or even like a couple of weeks just kind of rebuilding stuff. So that's about this.
Yeah, I agree. I think making the case from a monetary point is really important. I mean, at the end of the day, it's still a business, and a business exists to make money, right? So you can't just like, for example, go up to the CEO or even your manager and be like, I want to build a design system. And they'll be like, yeah, go ahead and be free, my child. That's not gonna happen. You actually have to put numbers behind it. And I think the other thing that happens when people start to come up with the idea of wanting to build a design system, they forget that a lot of it is not actually building out the system itself. It's a lot of conversation. There's so much talk. You know how many people I've spoken to at the New York Times? So many. You know how many people work at the New York Times? So many. I've had almost every single day is a conversation about the design system at the New York Times. People I've never met, people from different departments, and that's just like in the beginning phases of building out the design system, because it's literally quite hard to build out that system, again, without that shared language and without that shared understanding. I can't, for example, have this system be built if, say, marketing doesn't understand the value. If they just go off and start building their own things, then the design system has failed. And I think one of the things that happens oftentimes when trying to build a design system is, I'll give an example. So at the Times, we have a lot of traditionally trained graphic designers. And so I remember I was like super geeked about the design system and like getting it ready to go. And I was telling one of the designers there, like, yeah, design systems. And she was like, can I see it? And I was like, no, I don't have any way to show it. It's still like in conceptual, but it was just fascinating thinking that because she's a traditionally trained graphic designer, she thought that she could see it. And I think what's easy to do as a person who's trying to advocate for the design system, I could have easily said, oh, screw you, you're wrong. Like, you don't know anything about design systems. Or I can say, okay, maybe the message and the way in which I'm talking about design systems is being delivered in a way that is not easily understood by people who I need to get buy-in from. So I need to tweak my message so that they can understand and so that they can come on board so that everyone in the company can benefit from it.
I just wanted to build upon that, and like, I guess, for big companies, it definitely is like, or any companies, yeah, it's the dollar amount is like the bottom line. But I think there's other ways to show value too. I mean, you had said the word value, which I really agree with. And because, Justworks is a small startup, and, we don't have time for like A/B testing and actually getting data to be like, oh, you're gonna save like X number of dollars. I wish we did, but we can't do that. But like, I think there's other ways to show value, and like showing that the engineers or the designers are designing faster, creating things faster, showing that like a flow or like different parts of the site are now feel more cohesive. So that I just wanted to add that. And I think you asked about like people, like what type of people to get on the design system team. For me, it was really about the people who are passionate about it, and like, I think getting the people who are as passionate about the design system as I am, like, really helps, because they'll push you and make you better. And like, again, I'm making a lot of mistakes, and they'll forgive me. If someone's like doing this as a day job and I make mistakes, they'll really like, they'll not like me. So.
Oh, and let me add one more thing. Another thing is like you kind of have to kind of understand the people that are going to use it. So even at NASDAQ, what we did was like we sent a survey out to like a bunch of the developer teams and kind of saying what is useful, what do you like, whatever like that. And a lot of it, and that's kind of how the data visualization library came to play, where a lot of them said that would be very useful. So because you don't want to like build something and not have anyone use it. So you kind of want to get a good understanding of like, all right, if people really want this, then we're going to build it. But if people are not really interested in it, then you shouldn't spend time on it, basically. So, yeah.
Sorry. And so the other thing I wanted to add to that, we did a survey as well at the Times to find out like what to create and to put into this design system. So I completely agree. And I think that when you're asking about what people want out of it, make sure you don't fall into that jargon trap of like design systems, like pattern library, because they're like, what are you talking about? I don't understand this. So when we sent out the survey, we pretty much just said, it was kind of posited in a way that asked, like, how would you want to, or how do you think we could improve efficiency and build faster within the company?
Longest answer to a question ever, but that was awesome. That was a lot of insight, so thanks. We've got time for a few more questions down here at the front.
So you guys all talked a little bit about communicating with people to understand like their needs as you're building the system. Once you actually have it out, what kind of ways have you found for testing it, not just in terms of letting people, add to it if needed, but figuring out whether things like the language and the format actually work for people, especially when you're dealing with a very large number of potential users and maybe you can't actually sit down with everyone and test it with them?
Yeah, I think the best way to think about design systems is to consider it a product in and of itself. I think that a lot of people sometimes think of it as something separate besides the products that you might be building, like, say, like, so you were saying that you actually are building the design system while also shipping features, like, which is what I'm also doing at my job as well. And I think that some people kind of think that, oh, design system is a side project, but it's not. It's technically a full-fledged product in and of itself, and you have to treat it as such. And so even if you don't have the time to necessarily interview the people who might be using it, surveys work. You could put in components within the system itself that gets quick feedback, like, how did this work for you? Are you understanding what's happening here? If not, reach out to us so we can have a conversation about what's working for you, what's not, et cetera.
Kind of like what she was saying, but basically, I think for me, like, I had this saying where I was just like, get it done right now, and then kind of testing it right away. So even for the kind of like the data visualization library, what we did, that took us like 2 months. And what we did was like, we actually built it out, did the documentation, all that stuff. And basically, it wasn't perfect, but basically what we wanted to do was kind of test it out and see if it made sense. And before we start creating more like profiles or whatever like that, we kind of want to see if like people are actually use it. And even when we did some user testing on it, that's when we kind of found out like, oh, we should add this thing and kind of remove this and kind of expand on that. So that's why I always tell you is like kind of what you're saying is like use it as is the actual product, because you don't want to spend like 6 or 8 months building something and like no one's going to use it. You want to be able to like test it and test it really quickly. So.
Okay, we'll do this one and then this one, and then we might have to stop.
I'm just curious how you go about onboarding new hires, designers and engineers onto the system, and making sure they actually understand it from the get-go.
Well, I haven't done it, but I think we're getting a couple new hires. So I think how we're going to approach it, I think this is going to work. But definitely spending time just kind of getting familiar with the actual framework, because I think especially the one we have at NASDAQ is like it took me a while to kind of get a good understanding. So like letting people just know that you're not going to learn everything at once. So just like learn what you need to do to kind of get your job done, and then kind of like keep on expanding as the project kind of matures. And I think kind of like using that approach is better, because like I definitely did the whole thing where I tried to learn everything, and I was like, I'm not going to use this. I'm just going to do my own thing, which is not a good thing, but yeah.
I would just bake, what we've done is kind of try to just bake it in with the tools that they use. So like, you know, it's not really robust, but like making sure that the sketch template is like up to date with the most recent things, and even calling out certain things about it within the actual tool that they use, you know, kind of helps. But other than that, I'm not that experienced in onboarding, so that's about it.
Okay, there were a couple more questions. You've already asked one. Sorry, I'll do this last one here.
Thanks for your thoughts. Just once the system is like already set and done, do you have any methods for basically allowing for people's creativity to input back into the system? And can you talk about how you extend it so it's not just like, you know, playing with Lego bricks and basically removing a designer's creativity from the process?
I think for us, we're still in our infancy, so pass.
So I had a discussion about this, like with like a creative director of our team. So basically, what we have is like we have guidelines. So you don't necessarily have to follow them, but they're kind of a guidelines. So if you have some sort of like idea, you could be able to like prototype real quickly. But we kind of have the saying that if you think we could do something better without using kind of like the guidelines that we have set in place, then do it and kind of test it out and see if it works. And if we kind of want to do it in a place where we want to incorporate something back into the guidelines, then we do that. But I even for me, I kind of do it one way where it's like based on the guidelines, and maybe do something where it's like a crazy idea, because you never know what will kind of happen from that. So.
Yeah, I agree. The other thing that I would mention is that I actually think that the design system, rather than stifles creativity, it allows you to be more creative because you have the guidelines. So this is like a weird example that I thought of in my head just now. But pretend like the design system is like a track that a train is on. Obviously, if the train goes off the track, then all of us are going to die, and we don't want to die. But if you want to, you can change the color, the shape, the size of the train on the track. So that just because you have these guidelines that are pointing you in this general direction doesn't mean there are things that you can't do within those guidelines that would expand the creativity that you have as a designer.
Awesome.
Don't die.
Stay on the track, everyone. Well, thank you very much to our speakers. I know that there's lots more questions, but we do have some time for mingling and chatter and drinks and snacks. But yeah, thank you. A round of applause for the speakers. Thank you very much. And we have 2 more meetups lined up in July and August, and we'll be posting the information on our website, so keep an eye out. Thanks, everyone.
Some things were never said.